Hey everyone, it's Matt here, and welcome back to another episode of Commander Adventures. First things first, I'm sorry about missing an episode last week. I had something come up in my personal life, and I just ran out of time to do an edit. However, I'm more than glad to be back this week with a great game. First off we have Josh, playing Kynaios and Tiro. He kept a hand with Opal Palace, Seaside Citadel, Mystic Monastery, Jungle Shrine, Tempt with Glory, Regna's Sanction, and Gyrus Orrery. We then have Grayson, playing Gyrus Waker of Corpses. He kept Hungering Hydra, Whisper-Tongue Hydra, Phyrexian Hydra, a Swamp, Golgari Rot Farm, a Snow-Covered Forest, and Explosive Vegetation. We then have Brian, bringing back Izoni-TBA. He kept Emergent Zone, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, Command Tower, Entomb, Krosan Grip, Sidisi Undead Vizier, and Phyrexian Tower. Finally, we have Carissa, playing Brudiclad Telchor Engineer. She kept Siege Gang Commander, Felwar Stone, Windfall, Mystic Remora, and 3 snow-covered islands. Josh starts us off. He drops a tapped Seaside Citadel, and passes off. Grayson drops a Forest, and passes as well. Brian drops a Command Tower, and then Carissa closes out round 1 with a Terramorphic Expanse, which she cracks to bring in a tapped Mountain. Josh drops a Jungle Shrine before passing turn. Grayson drops a Swamp, and Brian entombs a Golgari Thug at Grayson's end step. Brian then moves to his turn, and dredges back the Thug in place of his draw. He drops a Phyrexian Tower, and casts the Thug before passing off. Carissa drops an Island, and casts a Felwar Stone before passing to Josh. Josh drops a Grove of the Burn Willows. He casts a Selvala Explorer Returned, and passes off. Grayson spends his third turn dropping a Mountain. Brian untaps, and sacrifices Golgari Thug to Phyrexian Tower on his upkeep. He goes to dredge back the Thug, before remembering he had to put a creature back on top of his library as it died. He mills the correct number of cards, and then readjusts the order to account for the Thug's death trigger. He drops an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and then recasts the Thug, before passing turn. Carissa drops an Island. She casts a Commander Sphere, and follows it up with a Mystic Remora, before passing off. Josh activates Selvala and main 1. They parlay, and Josh adds 1 green mana, and gains a life, before each player draws a card. Josh then drops a Plains, and casts his commander, Kynaios and Tiro. The Kings trigger at end step, and Josh draws a card, before putting in a Command Tower. Then Carissa drops a Darksteel Citadel, Brian draws a card, and Grayson drops a Golgari Rot Farm, bouncing his Mountain back to hand. On his turn, Grayson replays his Mountain. He casts an Explosive Vegetation, and Carissa draws a card off of Remora. Grayson then brings in a pair of Forests tapped, before passing off. Brian just draws for turn this time. He drops an Emergent Zone, and sacrifices Golgari Thug to Phyrexian Tower. As the Thug dies, Brian puts Craterhoof back on top of his library. He then casts a Green Sun Zenith, where X is 2. Carissa draws a card from Remora, and Brian brings in a Hermit Druid before passing off. Carissa pays for Mystic Remora on her upkeep. She drops a Command Tower, and then casts a Foundry Inspector. She follows up with a Thran Dynamo, and passes off. Josh drops a Mountain. He activates Selvala again, and everyone parlays. Josh then adds 3 green mana and gains 1 life, before everyone draws a card, except Brian, who replaces his draw by dredging back Golgari Thug. Josh then casts a Pendant of Prosperity, which enters the battlefield under Grayson's control. Josh follows up with a Leyline of Anticipation. The Kings trigger at his end step, and Josh draws, before putting in an Opal Palace. Then Grayson drops a Mountain, Brian drops a Field of the Dead, and Carissa drops an Island. Before turn passes, everyone lets Josh switch out Opal Palace with Mystic Monastery. Grayson then drops a forest. He casts a Hungering Hydra, which enters with 8+1/+1 counters before passing off. Brian activates Hermit Druid in his main one. He mills until he hits a forest, which he then plays for turn. He recasts Golgari Thug, and then casts a Victimize, as Carissa draws from Remora. Brian sacrifices the Golgari Thug, and chooses to return both Oracle of Moldiah and Runescarred Demon. Golgari Thug triggers on death, and Brian puts Birds of Paradise on top of his library. He then tutors up a card from Runescarred Demon before passing off. Carissa untaps, and pays to keep Mystic Remora, before dropping a Seat of the Synod. She casts a Siege Gang Commander, and creates 3 1/1 Goblin tokens as it enters, before passing off. Josh drops an Opal Palace for real. He activates Solvala, and everyone parlays. He adds 4 green mana, and gains 4 life, before everyone draws a card. Josh then casts an Avenger of Zendikar, and as it enters, he creates 8 0/1 plant tokens. Josh moves to end step, and draws, before putting in a Plains, which triggers Avenger of Zendikar. Then Grayson drops a forest, Carissa draws a card, and Brian replaces his draw by dredging back Golgari Thug. Before turn passes, Carissa casts a Frantic Search. She untaps 3 lands, before drawing 2, and then discarding 2. We then move to Grayson's turn. He drops a Cascading Cataracts, and then casts a Guardian Project, as Carissa draws from Mystic Remora. Grayson then follows up with a Whip-Tongue Hydra. In response to that, Josh flashes in a Regna's Sanction, naming himself and Grayson as friends, and Brian and Carissa as foes. Josh and Grayson each put a +1/+1 counter onto each creature they control, and then Brian and Carissa each choose an untapped creature they control and tap the rest. The Whip-Tongue Hydra then enters, destroys Runescarred Demon, and puts a +1/+1 counter onto itself, before Grayson draws a card from Guardian Project. Grayson then moves to combat and hits Brian for 9 before passing turn. Brian untaps. He casts a Soul Ring, and Carissa draws a card off of Mystic Remora. Brian then casts a Sidisi Undead Vizier. Sidisi exploits itself, and Brian goes to tutor up a card. After cuts, Brian reveals a Polluted Delta, and plays it for turn. He follows it up with a Cabal Coffers, before cracking the Delta to shock in an Overgrown Tomb. After that, he goes to activate Phyrexian Tower, and remembers he needed to make 3 zombies from Field of the Dead. He sacrifices one of the zombies to Phyrexian Tower, and uses that mana to activate Cabal Coffers. He adds 8 black mana, and then casts a Razaketh the Foul-Blooded. In response, Carissa casts a Spell Swindle. Razaketh is countered, and Carissa makes 8 treasure tokens. After that, Brian activates Hermit Druid, and mills 1, before putting a swamp to hand, and passing turn. Carissa untaps, and pays for Mystic Remora on her upkeep. In main 1, she casts the Brass's Bounty, and creates a total of 7 more treasure tokens. She then casts her commander, Brudiclad. She moves to combat, and creates a 2/1 blue mirror, and then makes all of her tokens on board into copies of that mirror. She swings all of her tokens at Josh, and Josh blocks with everything. 10 mirror die, and Josh takes 14 damage, before Carissa passes turn. In his main 1, Josh parlays again. He adds 2 green mana and gains 2 life, before everyone draws a card. He then follows up with an Evolution Sage. He moves to combat and swings his 8 plant tokens at Carissa. She blocks with Brudiclad, and Josh responds before damage, casting a Farseek. He brings in a Stomping Ground tapped, as Carissa draws from Mystic Remora. The Stomping Ground hitting puts a counter onto each of Josh's plants, and Evolution Sage allows him to proliferate all of his creatures' counters. Still before damage resolves through, Josh casts Attempt with Glory, and Carissa draws from Mystic Remora. No one else is tempted, but Josh still has more than enough damage to hit Carissa for 35, and kill Brudiclad in the process. Josh then moves to main 2, and drops his land for turn, once again triggering both Avenger and Evolution Sage. He then moves to his end step, and draws a card, before putting in a Forge of Heroes, which triggers everything again. Grayson and Brian each drop a land, and Carissa draws a card, as Brian creates a zombie from Field of the Dead. Also, Josh proliferates Grayson's Hydra once. Grayson drops a Forest, and then casts a Phyrexian Hydra. As it enters, he draws off of Guardian Project. Grayson then casts his Commander Gyrus, where X is 6. Gyrus enters with 9 counters, and then Grayson draws off of Guardian Project again, before passing off. Brian plays a Wooded Foothills, and creates a zombie token. He then sacrifices the zombie to Phyrexian Tower, as part of the cost to cast an Ayara. As she enters, each of Brian's opponents loses a life, while he gains a life. Brian then follows up by reanimating Razaketh, and also triggering Ayara as it enters. Hey everyone, I just wanted to mention that Brian didn't lose the life from Reanimate. It doesn't end up having an effect on this game, but it's still worth noting. Now, back to the game. Brian then pays 2 life and a zombie into Razaketh to go and tutor up a card. He activates Hermit Druid and mills a lot of cards. Until he hits a forest. He activates Razaketh twice more and tutors up 2 more cards. He then casts a Living Death and gives Carissa another draw. Everyone exchanges their creatures on board with the ones in their graveyard, and the following ETBs happen. Bontu enters to no effect. Brian fails to find with Fierce Empath. He reveals a swamp to Satyr Wayfinder. He fails to find with Woodland Bellower. He blows up Leyline, Pendant of Prosperity, and Mystic Remora with Terastodon, giving each of his opponents an elephant token. He chooses not to exploit with Sidisi. He fails to find with Runescarred Demon. He chooses not to sacrifice anything to Cavalier of Night. And finally, Eternal Witness hits, as Brian returns an Ashnod's Altar to hand. He then casts the Altar, and sacrifices everything but his Blood Artist effects, dealing a total of 55 damage to each of his opponents, while gaining 34 life, and closing out the game. Thanks for sticking around until the end of the video. We should be back to a regular schedule now, so expect another gameplay video next Saturday. And if I'm able to get it done, we should have a new episode of Enter the Infinite next week as well. Be safe, and thank you all for watching.